Now, I originally wasn't going to comment on the whole should Christians be cussing or not debate because there was a lot of voices getting thrown into it, but I did want to offer up one biblical theological approach that I didn't see other people taking. The first premise of my approach is that the Bible does indeed care about cultural norms. If you look in 1 Corinthians 11 or 1 Peter 3, Paul and Peter both respectively address very specific cultural norms that are happening within the societies in which they're writing these letters to, and they tell Christians to intentionally not go against these cultural norms in order to cause unnecessary cultural turmoil in the name of Christian liberty. We need to acknowledge that cuss words are in fact culturally charged and are primarily used to express an excess of emotion, usually negative or even crude. While culture is by no means our source of truth, it is in fact the context in which we've been placed. And Scripture seems to indicate that while we should by no means submit to all things of the culture, especially the sinful things of the culture, we should actually seek to live honorably and meekly within the society in which God has placed us. I think that abstaining from the use of words that the culture has deemed as immoral, crude, or distasteful would actually be a proper exercise of Christian honor and meekness within our given culture. This brings me to my second point, which is that curse words by their very nature are used to express an excess of emotion. Scripture very strongly teaches an ethic of Christian temperance, moderation, and self-control. Just look at the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5. The Bible defines temperance as emotional restraint or self-control. And while the argument would then be, okay, well, what if I'm cussing in light of an extreme positive emotion? I think that the point still stands that the primary usage of these words is to express an excess of negative emotion or distasteful emotion, which is why these words can quickly become stumbling blocks. Which brings me to my final point, which pulls from the stronger brother, weaker brother discourse in Romans 14, namely verses 13 through 23. In this passage, Paul is essentially telling the Roman church to honor one another by not causing one to stumble or one to be offended by eating foods that the other might deem to be ceremonially unclean. Paul acknowledges here that under the new covenant, all foods are clean, but he still says in verse 15 that if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. Our exercise of Christian liberty should never be at the expense of causing another brother or sister in the faith to stumble. And in a culture where curse words are deemed to be and widely understood to be negative and crude in their nature, I can hardly think of a time when Christians should justifiably cuss. I want to close by reminding both sides not to fall to legalism. On one side, we don't want to press up against the law and see how far our Christian liberties can take us before we fall into overt sin. On the other side, we don't want to add unnecessary restrictions that God has not made clear in His Word. In both instances, our eyes are on the law and not on Christ. Now, I'm not subtweeting. Jared and Elijah both make some super valid points. I just need to preach to myself that my love for Christ needs to be what drives this whole conversation.